It's going to be up to Arizona prosecutors to decide if parents should face charges after their baby died during a trip to the lake. What was supposed to be a fun family day out on the water turned into a nightmare when the little 4-month-old's parents realized she was unresponsive. And now an autopsy has been completed and the county attorney's office is reviewing the case. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. This is a tough one. It's not only tough because of how sad this story is, that's a given, but because it's difficult knowing what the right answer is in terms of legal responsibility. I say that because authorities are trying to decide whether to charge the parents of an infant who died last 4th of July weekend during a family boating outing. The Mojave County Sheriff's Office in Kingman, Arizona forwarded the case to the county attorney's office for, quote, review of potential negligent homicide charges. So now the question, of course, is what happened? And if you thought that this was a case of someone driving the boat recklessly and crashing, that's not the case. That's what I first thought when I read it. Not the case at all. This is, again, a bit more difficult to parse through. So we have Matthew and Alyssa Wroblewski of California, and they were spending the day on Lake Havasu in Arizona on July 5th of last year. And that is when they found their little daughter, 4-month-old Tanna Rae, unresponsive in the boat. Around 5:30 in the afternoon, according to an autopsy report, she was transported by boat to Lake Havasu Regional Medical Center and then to Phoenix Children's Hospital, where she died. This is an awful, awful situation. But again, what happened? How did this child die? Well, here's the thing. Now that the Maricopa County Medical Examiner has completed an autopsy, we are learning a lot more. So according to Newsweek, the autopsy report describes Tanna Rae's death as an accident, quote, caused by complications of environmental heat exposure and elevated environmental temperatures. And I want you to picture this. This is Arizona in July, so the temperatures reached almost 120 degrees that day. That's according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And the National Weather Service had actually issued an excessive heat warning for the whole state. So the autopsy report listed multiple heat-related injuries, including hemorrhagic shock, rapid decrease in hemoglobin, dehydration, an anoxic brain injury, meaning the brain was deprived of oxygen, a cerebral edema, which is when the brain swells because of excess fluid buildup. But here's the thing, that this is important. If you're wondering if this is about prior abuse, the autopsy report also noted that Tanna Rae, who was technically 3 months and 27 days old, was a, quote, well-developed, well-nourished female infant. So seemingly healthy before this lake outing. And the autopsy report, again, as reported by Newsweek, says that around 5 p.m. that day, Tanna Rae was put down for a nap after breastfeeding, and she was reportedly wearing damp clothing. She was beneath a covered section of the boat and had a fan blowing in her direction. But that evidently wasn't enough to keep her cool and safe. And by the way, it arguably goes to the idea of her parents having knowledge of how hot it was. And we'll get to that more in a minute. But the autopsy finding states, quote, the parents reportedly entered the water for a brief period of time and returned to the boat to find the decedent unresponsive with blood exiting her nose and clear fluid coming from her mouth. The family reportedly called for emergency services and initiated CPR. And reportedly EMTs showed up just a few minutes later. They saw a family member doing CPR. This is all according to the documentation. And Tanna Rae was rushed to the hospital. There was reportedly no obvious trauma to her body. Now, emergency personnel, they tried their best to save this 4-month-old with multiple rounds of CPR, doses of epinephrine, but she was pronounced dead just before midnight. And here is what is important to remember. So according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, newborns and infants, they are particularly susceptible to dehydration and heat stroke, and the AAP encourages parents not to leave young children outside for a long period of time if the temperature exceeds 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Maricopa County Medical Examiner Tiffany Morrison concluded in her report, quote, in consideration of the known circumstances surrounding this death, the available medical history, and the examination of the remains, it is my opinion that the cause of death is ascribed to complications of environmental heat exposure. It is further my opinion that the manner of death is accident. However, it appears that the sheriff's office forwarded the information to the county attorney's office to see if they will conclude that Matthew and Alyssa, the parents, should be criminally charged in connection with their daughter Tanna Rae's death. And here is something else to note as well. Apparently, Matthew is a police officer in Riverside, California, and a spokesperson told Newsweek that Matthew was still with the department, that they wouldn't be commenting on the situation. Now, here's something else to note. In the aftermath of this baby's death, Alyssa was listed as the recipient on a GoFundMe page that raised almost $50,000 before the organizer took it down, which they can do at any time. And GoFundMe told Newsweek that the organizer had not appeared to break any of the platform's rules, that the fundraiser was categorized under funerals and memorials. And GoFundMe told Newsweek when a fundraiser is created to support another individual, funds are safely held by our payment processors and only transferred to the recipient of the fundraiser. We can confirm that all funds raised will go directly to the listed beneficiary for funeral expenses as stated in the fundraiser description. And the page said that medical personnel at the hospital did everything in their power to revive her, but God had other plans and took Tanna to heaven that night. Our precious baby girl gave us her last smiles. We gave her our last kisses. We will never understand why you had to leave so soon. You were just too perfect. And not long after the fundraiser started, investigators announced that they were looking into Tanna Rae's death. And so far, no one has been arrested or charged, and it's our understanding. GoFundMe apparently told Newsweek that this couple, even if they're charged, even if they're convicted, they could still technically be entitled to the money on the GoFundMe page. Now, I had a chance to speak with Arizona criminal defense attorney Aaron Reed about this case. Take a listen. Aaron, thanks so much for coming here on Sidebar. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
It's a really, really sad story. What is just your overall reaction to this story?
Well, first, it's something that you don't really see that often. The 4-month-old, it's tragic. It's sad. It's really something that should never happen. And I don't know, it's hard to get inside the parents' minds and figure out what they were thinking at that time, but I'm hard pressed to find most parents that think that would be a good idea to take a 4-month-old out onto a boat in any weather, let alone 120 degrees in the middle of summer in Arizona. So it's just tragic all around, and it should have been avoided.
Yeah, look, this is not an easy story to cover, but it is very, very important because these kinds of terrible tragedies, they happen a lot, and we want to shed a light on what happens. And I got to really thank and I appreciate our partner and sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, because it's with their support that helps us to tell these stories and produce this. And this is, by the way, America's largest personal injury law firm. They have over 1,000 attorneys. You know why? They win a lot. I mean, listen to this. In the past few months, Morgan & Morgan secured a $29 million verdict for a bicyclist in Philadelphia, a $2.7 million verdict for a car accident victim in Florida, not to mention $5.6 million for a car crash victim in Georgia after insurance offered that client $0. So even if you think your case isn't worth millions of dollars, why not start a claim and fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so simple. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. Well, that's definitely true in terms of, whether or not that this was a really bad parenting decision and this was a morally terrible decision. The question is this a crime? It's incredibly sad, but do you think a crime was committed here? I mean, do you think these parents will face charges such as, let's say, negligent homicide? What do you think?
I think there are a few different avenues for criminal prosecutions on this kind of thing. And I've thought about this. There's different statutes, and every state has different levels of homicides. Arizona is no different. Negligent homicide, as you mentioned, is one of them. I think that one would fit pretty easily into the fact pattern. But the question I have is, could they get something? Could they, meaning the prosecution in Mojave County, could they look for something more severe, such as a manslaughter or even a second-degree murder? And I know that sounds weird or crazy, but in Arizona, I have a lot of clients that have had DUIs. They crash into someone and kill them, which is a reckless action and an accident, and they're charged with second-degree murder. And the cause of death here was an accident, and the conduct appeared to be reckless. So I could see a prosecutor possibly charging a second-degree murder if they were that bold. But I do think there are a few different avenues to criminal prosecution.
Well, I mean, the difference would be they weren't high or drunk and operating a vehicle, and this was like a crash or something of that nature. I mean, you could say they shouldn't have brought their child into excessive heats like this and the way they were, jumped back into the water. But why would it be negligent homicide? Why would it be second degree murder? What crosses the line between an accident, a tragedy, and a crime? You could hold the parents morally responsible for what happened here, but why should you hold them legally responsible? Let's talk about that line.
It's a great question. And that's something that, as lawyers, that's what we try to do every day. And I have had cases with accidents that they call homicides and homicides that were accidents. And that line is not always easy to see. I would say in most situations, when you're dealing with a negligent homicide, anything that a normal, reasonable person would look at it and say, okay, that's probably not something you should do. You could probably make a case for negligence, such as bringing a 4-month-old outside in 120-degree weather and leaving them out there for an extended period of time. That could be considered a negligent action or negligence on part of the child. Where it crosses over is the recklessness. So that part of the mens rea or the mental state is the reasonable person standard. Would a reasonable person in those parents' situation believe that their conduct is reckless? I think a lot of people would probably say that. And I think you could possibly get 12 jurors to agree that the conduct that they undertook was reckless. It seems like a stretch to get it to second degree. I don't quite think it'll get there, although I've seen crazier things happen with prosecutors. But I do think this is kind of the question between a negligent homicide versus a manslaughter and finding that line.
And the argument would be, it was incredibly hot. There was an excessive heat warning from experts. I believe that was released the day before. The parents should have known or been expected to know how dangerous it would be to do this. You mentioned a jury. You think you'd be able to convince a jury that, and I'm talking to you, but prosecutors, you think they'd be able to convince a jury that these parents committed a crime? I mean, there's one thing that you look at pictures of this 4-month-old, you look at what happened here, you want to have some sense of justice, but I can imagine defense attorneys would say they're crushed. This was a tragedy. They, things like this happen, unfortunately, across the country where parents are doing things like it might not be foreseeable, might not be known that this would happen, that parents always take their children out, whether it's cold or whether it's hot. Again, not justifying or excusing what happened here, but don't you think it would be tough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that they committed a crime?
Oh, I definitely think it would be tough. But a lot of homicide cases, even from the prosecution's perspective, are tough. And defense attorneys that are really good at their job, they make it tough. And that's part of the game and part of the system. But when I look at something like this, I see people across the country that are charged in negligent actions because their child drowned in the pool and they weren't watching them.
Right.
These people, they knew they were on Lake Havasu. They frequented Lake Havasu on boats. They were outside a lot. They knew Arizona heat. They know all of these things. And not only that, but you could bring in some sort of a scientific component with doctors and medical experts and young children under the age of 2 or 3. They don't have a great ability to regulate their own body temperatures. And as a parent, you should probably know that before bringing them out into extreme weather. It's one thing to bring them outside, go get the mail, stay out there for a few minutes or whatever, but it's another to be out there on a lake for an extended period of time with really nowhere to go, but just hot everywhere around you. And that's, I think, where a prosecutor could draw that line. And I think it would come down to the type of jury that you get. And in that county, they're extremely conservative and not the best ideal jury pool for these kinds of things.
Are there, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but are there specific laws or regulations that have to be followed out on the water that could impact this prosecution? Is there something that they were alerted to before that, I don't know, was there some sort of sign, it's a hot day, you're going to be in the sun, you should take care? Is there anything like that that would affect this case?
I'm sure there, in addition to the excessive heat warnings, right? Anytime a person is on a boat, there are things about life jackets and things like that. I believe that she did have a life jacket on and those kinds of precautions. So they were taking those steps. But as far as just the overall exposure to the heat, I don't know if there was explicit signs or things like that around the lake. I'm sure there were constant reminders to stay hydrated, stay out of the sun, be careful. There is an excessive heat warning across the entire state during that time of the year. And it's common all the way up from Mojave County down to the southern border where you see people hiking or whatever they're doing, and grown adults are dying, let alone 4-month-olds that can't do anything to help themselves. So I think it definitely is a gray area as far as criminal charges, but I would not be shocked if they pulled the trigger and actually filed them. That wouldn't surprise me.
By the way, these parents, they've received, I believe, nearly $50,000 in GoFundMe donations. And my understanding is GoFundMe came out and said that these parents can still keep the money even if they're charged. My question would be, does the GoFundMe come into evidence for either side at a trial?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it would depend on a lot of the language in the GoFundMe account, what they were saying. Anything that they type out on their own, right? That can be used as some sort of an admission. Maybe it can be used as a statement against them. I think that is a possibility that they could use that evidence in trial. And that would be a pretty unique piece of evidence to use, something you don't quite see very often. And I think that would be an interesting angle to take for a prosecutor. And I think that this kind of case would need those kinds of pieces of evidence, right? You need medical evidence. You need experts to talk about how children are different from adults, how infants are different from adults. You would need those kinds of pieces of evidence, and it would be a unique case and an interesting situation for a prosecutor to go through.
By the way, so this child dies in Arizona. The family is from California. Are there challenges to prosecuting this in the sense that, maybe they, a different state, they didn't know exactly what was going on? Are there challenges about prosecuting somebody from a different state, or is this already, like we talked about, they frequented this, they should have known, they can easily be prosecuted in Arizona even if they're from another state? Anything we should be thinking about there?
No, and anybody that travels from any other state to whatever state that you're traveling to, it's presumed that you're supposed to follow the rules and the laws of that state that you're in, regardless of whether you've been there once, 100 times, or how frequently you go there. And it doesn't take a scientist to see a temperature gauge and know that it's extremely hot out. Even if you're from California, it gets plenty hot in California. Right. And I know the Inland Empire and things like that, it gets almost just as hot as it does here. So they have knowledge about the heat and what that does to the human body. And I think that is not going to fly. I mean, regardless of whether you're from, you come to Arizona, you go to Nevada, in Vegas, people get arrested on the strip partying all the time that have never been there. It doesn't really matter. That's not going to be a defense for them.
Let me ask you this. So Matthew is actually a police detective in California. Does that affect the case in the sense that, it's first of all, will be tough. Will the jury know his profession? That's number one. Would a jury be tough to prosecute, would convict somebody who's a member of law enforcement? But also, having that skill set, having that training, being aware of circumstances and surroundings, I wonder if that could hurt him.
That's an interesting point as well. I think there are things that could hurt him as far as his training, his experience, knowing what human life is about as a detective. But there are, I think, things that could help him in the sense that he is a detective. He's a law enforcement officer. How eager would other law enforcement officers be to pursue charges in a gray sort of area against another fellow law enforcement officer? I think that sort of thing it happens across the entire country, whether we like it or not. Some people get preferential treatment. Some people might get treated a little differently based on their status. So that has to be factored in, can't be ignored. I do think that could help him avoid charges. And even if he does get charged, will a jury know what his profession is? That's a great question. I think in my eyes, I would try to keep it out unless I knew my client was going to take the stand. Yeah. Then I would prepare for it in that way. But if he wasn't going to testify, I don't know how his profession would be relevant to the facts of that day, unless this prosecutor was able to bring it in that he has some sort of medical training through being a detective.
Well, let's see what happens. Let's see if the parents are ultimately charged. Again, not entirely sure whether that should happen or will happen, but we'll keep our eyes open for that. Aaron Reed, thank you so much for coming on and talking about what is really just a sad, sad case. This is a tough one to talk about, but appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.